Some betrayals cut so deep they rewrite your entire understanding of family. My name is Cyan Johnson, and I'm about to tell you how the two people I trusted most in this world systematically destroyed everything my father left me. This isn't just about money. It's about discovering that the mother who raised you and the man she chose to replace your father are capable of calculated deception that would make strangers blush. The inheritance my father left me was supposed to secure my future. Instead, it became the weapon they used to steal it.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 months after I'd graduated from Northwestern with a degree in marketing and moved back to my childhood home in Riverside, Illinois. I was 23, drowning in student loans, and desperately searching for entry-level positions that paid more than coffee money. Living with my mom, Patricia Johnson, and my stepfather, Derek Martinez, felt like a temporary setback, not the beginning of a nightmare. Derek had been in our lives for 8 years, marrying my mother when I was 15. He was everything my late father wasn't: loud where Dad had been thoughtful, impulsive where Dad had been methodical, and always talking about his next big business venture where Dad had quietly built his accounting firm brick by brick. But Derek made my mother laugh again after years of grief, and for that alone, I'd learned to accept him. The letter that changed everything bore the letterhead of Morrison, Caldwell and Associates, the law firm that had handled my father's estate. Inside, Mr. Harold Morrison's carefully typed words felt like a punch to the chest. Dear Ms. Johnson, I hope this letter finds you well. As you are now 23 years old, the trust established by your late father, Thomas Johnson, has reached its maturation date. Per the terms outlined in his will, you are now entitled to receive the full inheritance, which currently totals $347,000. This amount includes the original $200,000 life insurance payout, plus 8 years of conservative investment growth through the trust. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to schedule an appointment for the transfer of funds. Sincerely, Harold Morrison, Senior Partner. I read the letter 3 times before the numbers truly registered. $347,000. My father, my quiet, careful father, who had died of a heart attack when I was 15, had left me enough money to pay off my student loans, put a down payment on a house, maybe even start the marketing consultancy I dreamed about during late-night study sessions. My hands were shaking as I walked into the kitchen, where my mother was making her morning coffee. Patricia Johnson had aged gracefully into her early 50s, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, her green eyes still bright despite the lines that spoke of years spent worrying about bills and raising a daughter alone before Derek came along. "Mom," I said, my voice barely steady, "did you know about this?" I handed her the letter, watching as her expression shifted from curiosity to something that looked almost like panic. She set down her coffee mug with a sharp clink against the marble countertop, the expensive countertop Derek had insisted on during their kitchen renovation 2 years ago. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice taking on that carefully neutral tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news. "We need to talk." "We need to talk?" I repeated. "Mom, this letter says Dad left me almost $350,000. Why did you ever mention this?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter in her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes held an expression I'd never seen before, guilt mixed with something that looked almost like resignation. "Cyan, sit down," she said gently. "There's something Derek and I need to explain." Derek chose that moment to enter the kitchen, his work boots heavy against the tile floor. At 51, he was still handsome in a rugged way, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of easy smile that probably charmed my grieving mother 8 years ago. He worked construction, managing crews for a mid-sized company, and his hands showed the evidence of decades of hard labor. "Morning, kiddo," he said, then noticed the tension in the room. "Everything okay?" My mother handed him the letter without a word. I watched Derek's face as he read, looking for surprise, confusion, anything that would indicate he was learning this information for the first time. Instead, I saw the same guilty recognition that had crossed my mother's features. "Ah," he said, setting the letter on the counter. "So, it's time." "Time for what?" I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Time for someone to explain why I'm just now learning that my father left me a small fortune?" Derek pulled out chair at the kitchen table, his movements deliberate and careful. "Cyan, my mom and I have been managing that money for years. We've been borrowing from it, with every intention of paying it back." "Borrowing?" The word borrowing hit me like ice water. "Borrowing?" "The business ventures I've been working on," Derek continued, his voice taking on the earnest tone he used when trying to convince someone to see things his way. "The restaurant franchise opportunity 3 years ago. The construction consulting firm I started last year. They all required capital. Significant capital." I looked back and forth between them, feeling like I was in some kind of fever dream. "You've been using my inheritance to fund Derek's business ideas?" "Not using," my mother interjected quickly. "Borrowing. Derek's been keeping meticulous records of every penny. Haven't you, honey?" Derek nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. Every transaction is documented. The restaurant thing didn't work out. The franchise company went under. Nothing we could do about that. But the consulting firm is just starting to turn a profit. We're looking at being able to pay back a significant portion within the next 2 years." "A significant portion?" I repeated slowly. "How much of my inheritance is gone, Derek?" The silence that followed was deafening. My mother was staring at her hands, and Derek was studying the ceiling as if it held the answers to life's greatest mysteries. "Derek," I said again, my voice deadly quiet now. "How much?" "Most of it," he admitted finally. "But Cyan, you have to understand, these were investments in our family's future. When the consulting firm really takes off, we'll all benefit. Your mom won't have to worry about retirement. We can help you with your student loans." "How much is left?" I interrupted. Derek cleared his throat. "About 18,000. The kitchen seemed to tilt sideways. $347,000 reduced to 18,000. My father's life insurance money, the money he'd carefully invested to secure my future, gone into Derek's failed restaurant franchise and struggling consulting firm. 18,000, I repeated numbly. "But that's just the liquid amount," Derek said quickly. "I have assets tied up in the business, equipment, client contracts that are about to pay out big. The total value of what we've invested is actually higher than the original amount." "Assets," I said, feeling like I was speaking a foreign language. "You turned my inheritance into your business assets." "Our assets," my mother corrected gently. "Cyan, Derek and I are married. What's his is mine, and what's mine is—" "Mine was supposed to be mine," I exploded, standing up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. "That money wasn't yours to borrow from. It was Dad's insurance money, left specifically for me." "Your father would have wanted what's best for the family," Derek said, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge. "He would have understood that sometimes you have to take risks to build something better." I stared at him, this man who had never met my father, who was now presuming to speak for a dead man's wishes. My father, who had been so careful with money that he'd clipped coupons and driven the same Honda Civic for 10 years, would have understood risking my inheritance on business ventures? "I want it back," I said quietly, "all of it." "Honey," my mother said, reaching for my hand, "it's not that simple. The money is tied up in legitimate business investments. Derek has been working so hard to make this work for all of us." "I don't care about Derek's business," I snapped, pulling my hand away. "I care about the money my father left me, the money you both apparently decided I didn't deserve to know about." "That's not fair," Derek said, his voice defensive now. "We were protecting you. You were in college, focused on your studies. The last thing you needed was the stress of managing that kind of money." "So you managed it for me, by spending it?" "By investing it," he corrected firmly, "by trying to grow it into something bigger." Do you think your father would have wanted you to just stick that money in a savings account and let it sit there? The casual way he invoked my father's memory, the presumption that he understood a man he had never met better than I did, sent white-hot rage through my veins. But underneath the anger was something worse, a growing realization that I had been living in a house with people who had been lying to me for years. "I'm calling the lawyer," I said finally. "Cyan, please," my mother started, but I was already walking toward the stairs. "I'm calling Mr. Morrison right now, and I'm going to find out exactly what legal rights I have." Behind me, I heard Derek's voice, lower now and meant for my mother's ears, but still audible. "This is exactly what I was worried about. We should have told her years ago." And my mother's response, barely a whisper, "It's too late for that now." As I climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom, the letter still clutched in my hand, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family had just crumbled. The inheritance my father had left me, his final gift, his way of taking care of me even after death, had been treated as a piggy bank for Derek's entrepreneurial dreams. But what terrified me most wasn't the missing money. It was the growing suspicion that this conversation had only revealed the tip of a much deeper betrayal, and that the two people I trusted most in the world had been lying to me for 8 long years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Harold Morrison's office felt like stepping back in time. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, heavy leather-bound law books filled floor-to-ceiling shelves, and the scent of old paper and furniture polish hung in the air. At 72, Mr. Morrison had the kind of presence that commanded respect. Silver hair perfectly combed, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, and a way of speaking that made every word feel carefully chosen. I'd called his office immediately after the kitchen confrontation, and his secretary had somehow found me an appointment for that same afternoon. Now, sitting across from him in a wing-back chair that had probably been in his office longer than I'd been alive, I felt both grateful and terrified. "Ms. Johnson," he said, reviewing the files spread across his mahogany desk. "I must say I'm surprised to be having this conversation. Your father was very specific about the terms of your trust." "What exactly were those terms?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Mr. Morrison adjusted his glasses and pulled out what looked like the original will. "Your father established an irrevocable trust for your benefit, with very clear instructions. The funds were to remain untouched until your 23rd birthday, at which point they would be transferred to you in their entirety, including any growth from conservative investments." "And who had access to those funds before now?" "No one," he said firmly. "That was the entire point of structuring it as an irrevocable trust. Your mother was named as your guardian for the trust documentation, but she had no legal authority to withdraw funds. Only our firm, as trustees, could make investment decisions, and only within the very conservative parameters your father specified." The room seemed to spin slightly. "So, my mother and stepfather couldn't have legally accessed that money?" Mr. Morrison's expression grew grave. "Ms. Johnson, are you telling me someone has been withdrawing funds from your trust?" I explained everything. The kitchen confrontation, Derek's admission about borrowing the money, the reduction from $347,000 to $18,000. As I spoke, Mr. Morrison's face grew increasingly stern, and he began making notes in a legal pad with swift, angry strokes. "This is extraordinary," he said when I finished. "The trust account requires 2 signatures for any withdrawal, mine and that of my partner, James Caldwell. We would never have authorized personal loans to family members." "Then how did they get the money?" Mr. Morrison was already reaching for his phone. "Margaret, please pull the complete file for the Thomas Johnson Trust immediately."
Yes, I need every transaction record from the past 8 years. He hung up and turned back to me. Ms. Johnson, I need you to understand something. If what you're telling me is true, we're not talking about family disagreements over money. We're talking about fraud. The word hit me like a physical blow. Fraud. Not borrowing, not poor judgment, not even betrayal in the family sense. Actual criminal fraud. Margaret, an efficient-looking woman in her 50s, appeared with a thick folder. Mr. Morrison spread the contents across his desk, and I watched his face transform from concern to outright anger as he reviewed document after document. "This is extraordinary," he muttered, pulling out bank statements and transaction records. "Look at this, Ms. Johnson. Here's the trust account balance as of January of this year, $341,000. But according to our records, we never authorized a single withdrawal." He showed me page after page of statements. The money had been systematically drained through electronic transfers, all bearing forged authorization signatures. The transfers were clever, never large enough to trigger automatic alerts, spread out over months and years, but relentlessly consistent. "How is this even possible?" I asked, staring at the evidence of what now looked like a methodical, long-term theft. "Someone with access to your personal information, your social security number, copies of identification documents, someone who could convincingly impersonate you or forge documents in your name." Mr. Morrison's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Ms. Johnson, your stepfather would have had access to all of this information, wouldn't he?" The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Derek, who had been present when I applied for colleges and filled out financial aid forms. Derek, who had helped me set up my first bank account when I turned 18. Derek, who had access to all our family's important documents stored in the filing cabinet in their shared home office. "We need to call the police," Mr. Morrison said, reaching for his phone again. "Wait," I said quickly. The reality of what that meant, criminal charges, police investigation, my mother potentially facing legal consequences, crashed over me. Is there any way to handle this without involving law enforcement?" Mr. Morrison studied me over his glasses. "Ms. Johnson, approximately $329,000 has been stolen from your trust through what appears to be systematic identity fraud. This isn't a civil matter anymore. This is grand theft."
"But your mother was either complicit in this fraud or she's a victim as well," he said gently but firmly. "Either way, the only path to recovering your inheritance is through the legal system." I sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what I discovered. This wasn't Derek making poor investment choices with money he'd been given permission to use. This was a calculated, years-long theft that required forged documents, false identities, and systematic deception. "There's something else," Mr. Morrison said, pulling out another document. "Your father included a specific provision in his will that I think you should know about." He handed me a copy of what looked like a letter, written in my father's careful handwriting. "If anyone attempts to access Cyan's trust fund before her 23rd birthday, or if there are any irregularities with the account, Harold Morrison has my explicit instructions to pursue legal action to the fullest extent of the law. This money represents everything I was unable to give my daughter while I was alive. It is her security, her freedom, and her future. Anyone who would steal from her inheritance would steal from her father's grave." Reading my father's words, written when I was just 15, and he was facing his own mortality, broke something inside me. He had tried to protect me even from beyond death, and someone had circumvented every safeguard he had put in place. "Ms. Johnson," Mr. Morrison said quietly, "your father was my friend as well as my client. We served together on the Riverside Community Foundation Board for 5 years. If he were here today,
What do you think he would want you to do? I knew the answer immediately. My father had been the most honest person I'd ever known. He'd returned extra change to cashiers, reported errors in his favor on tax returns, and taught me that integrity wasn't negotiable. He would want the truth, regardless of the consequences. I want to file charges, I said finally. But first, I want to confront them with this evidence. I want to give them one chance to explain. Mr. Morrison nodded slowly. I understand your desire to handle this within the family first, but I strongly advise you to be careful. People who are capable of this level of deception are also capable of destroying evidence or taking other steps to cover their tracks. What do you mean? I mean that as soon as they realize you know the truth, they might panic. They might try to hide documents, claim the money is gone forever, or even attempt to manipulate you emotionally into not pursuing legal action. He pulled out his business card and wrote his personal cell phone number on the back. I want you to call me immediately after you speak with them. Don't let them convince you to wait. Don't let them talk you into working something out privately. This level of theft requires immediate legal action. As I left his office, my head was spinning with new information. The conversation I thought was about poor financial decisions was actually about felony theft. The stepfather I'd grown to trust had been systematically stealing from me for years. The mother who'd raised me had either been lying to my face or was somehow unaware that her husband was a criminal. The drive home felt like traveling toward a confrontation that would destroy my family permanently. But as I pulled into the driveway of the house I'd grown up in, the house with the expensive kitchen renovation, the new hardwood floors, the landscaping Derek had installed last spring, I realized I was looking at my inheritance. All around me were the physical manifestations of my father's stolen money. Inside, I could hear Derek on the phone in his home office, his voice animated as he discussed some new business opportunity with a potential client. My mother was in the living room watching the evening news with a glass of wine, the very picture of suburban contentment. Neither of them looked like criminals. But then again, I was learning that the most dangerous thieves were often the ones who convinced you to trust them first. I walked upstairs to my room and spread Mr. Morrison's evidence across my desk. Bank statements, transaction records, copies of forged authorization forms. Everything looked official, legitimate, carefully crafted to fool bank representatives and legal trustees alike. This wasn't the work of someone who stumbled into poor decisions or borrowed money with good intentions. This was the work of someone who had planned, from the very beginning, to steal everything my father had left me. The question now was whether my mother was Derek's partner in crime or his most successful victim.
I waited until the next evening to confront them, spending the day strategizing and mentally preparing for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. Derek had left early for a job site in Aurora, giving me time to approach my mother alone first. I found her in the sunroom, tending to her orchids, a hobby she'd picked up since marrying Derek, something about nurturing delicate things back to health. "Mom, we need to talk about the inheritance situation," I said, settling into the wicker chair across from her. She didn't look up from the pale pink orchid she was misting. "Honey, I told you Derek is gathering all the paperwork. These things take time. I went to see Mr. Morrison yesterday." Her hand stilled on the spray bottle. For a long moment, the only sound was the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the same clock that had belonged to my father's family for 3 generations. "You did what?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. I pulled out photocopies of the bank statements Mr. Morrison had given me. "Mom, Derek didn't borrow from my trust fund. He stole from it, with forged documents and fake authorizations." Patricia finally looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not just guilt, but fear. Real, bone-deep terror. "Cyan, you don't understand the whole situation." "Then explain it to me," I interrupted, spreading the evidence across the glass-top table between us.
Explain how Derek managed to withdraw money from an irrevocable trust that required 2 lawyers' signatures. Explain these bank transfers that happened while I was away at college, using authorization documents I never signed. My mother stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking. Derek said the lawyers had given him special permission because of your college expenses. What college expenses? I had scholarships and student loans. You never used trust money for my education. The supplemental costs, books, housing, your car repairs. She was grasping now, and we both knew it. Mom, I leaned forward, forcing her to meet my eyes. Did you know Derek was forging my signature on withdrawal forms? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking, the distant sound of traffic on Route 45, all the normal sounds of suburban life continuing while my world imploded. I thought, she started, then stopped. Derek handled all the financial paperwork. He said he had experience with legal documents from his construction business. I trusted him to do everything properly. So you knew he was taking the money? I knew he was accessing it for investments, yes. But Cyan, he showed me official-looking papers, bank statements that showed the money was being moved into business accounts. Everything looked legitimate. I studied my mother's face, searching for signs of deception. What I saw instead was a woman who had been so desperate to believe in her second chance at love that she'd willfully ignored red flags that should have been obvious. Mom, did you ever actually see these business accounts? Did you ever ask to review the investment portfolios Derek claimed to be building? She shook her head slowly. Derek said I wouldn't understand the financial complexities. He said it was better for me to focus on other things while he handled the business side. The front door slammed, and Derek's voice boomed through the house. Pat? Cyan? I'm home. His work boots echoed across the hardwood floors as he made his way toward the sunroom. In here, my mother called weakly. Derek appeared in the doorway, still wearing his dusty work clothes, a smile on his face that faded the moment he saw the documents spread across the table. His eyes flicked from the bank statements to my mother's stricken expression to my carefully neutral face. "What's all this?" he asked, but his tone had already shifted from casual to guarded. "This is evidence of 8 years of fraud. Evidence that you've been systematically stealing from my inheritance using forged documents and false authorizations." Derek found through a series of expressions: surprise, indignation, calculation, before settling on righteous anger. "Now hold on just a minute. I've been investing that money for your benefit." "Stop," I interrupted. "Derek, I know you've been forging my signature on withdrawal forms. I know you've been impersonating me to bank representatives. I know this because the lawyers have records of every single fraudulent transaction." He stood there for a moment, and I could practically see him weighing his options. Then, to my complete shock, he laughed.
You know what, Cyan? You're absolutely right. I did forge your signature. I did make those withdrawals without proper authorization. He walked over to the window, looking out at the backyard he'd landscaped with my father's money. "And I'd do it again." My mother gasped. "Derek!" "No, Pat. I'm tired of tiptoeing around this. Cyan wants the truth. Here's the truth." He turned back to face us, and his expression was harder than I'd ever seen it. "That money was sitting there doing nothing while this family struggled. Do you remember what our financial situation was like 8 years ago, Cyan? Your mother was working 2 jobs just to keep this house. We were behind on the mortgage, behind on car payments, living paycheck to paycheck. So you decided to steal from me?" "I decided to save this family," he shot back. "That money would have sat in that trust account earning 2% interest while your mother lost her house, your father's house. Instead, I used it to stabilize our situation, to invest in opportunities that could benefit all of us." "Opportunities like the restaurant franchise that failed?"
Derek's jaw tightened. That wasn't my fault. The parent company went bankrupt due to factors completely outside my control. I lost money on that deal too. You lost my money, I corrected. I lost family money trying to build a better future for this family, he said, his voice rising. And you know what? Some of those investments did pay off. The consulting business is profitable now. This house has doubled in value since I've been making improvements. Your mother hasn't had to work 2 jobs in 6 years because of the financial stability I created. I stared at him, amazed by his ability to reframe felony theft as family sacrifice. Derek, you stole $329,000 from me. That's not creating stability. That's destroying my future to pay for your present. Your future? He laughed bitterly. Cyan, you're 23 years old, living in your parents' house with no job prospects. What exactly were you planning to do with that money? Blow it on a fancy apartment and expensive clothes until it ran out? The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. I was planning to pay off my student loans, maybe buy a house, start a business. With no experience, no business plan, no understanding of how the real world works, Derek interrupted. At least I used that money for something productive. You used it without my permission. I used it to keep this family afloat, he shouted, finally losing his composure completely. And if you can't understand that, if you're so selfish that you'd rather see your own mother lose her home than let me invest your precious inheritance, then maybe you're not the person I thought you were. My mother had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke up, her voice barely audible. Derek, you told me you had legal permission to access those funds. Derek turned to her, and for a moment his expression softened. Pat, I told you what you needed to hear to keep you from worrying. The end result is the same. I used that money to build something better for all of us. By lying to me? By forging documents? By committing fraud? By doing what needed to be done, he said firmly, and I'm not apologizing for protecting this family. I stood up, gathering the bank statements. Derek, I'm giving you one chance to make this right. You have 48 hours to return every penny you stole, or I'm filing criminal charges. Derek's laugh was cold now. With what, Cyan? That money is gone. It's invested in the business, tied up in assets, used for legitimate family expenses over 8 years. You can file all the charges you want, but you can't get blood from a stone. The business assets, then, liquidate everything, sell the equipment, transfer the contracts, whatever it takes. And destroy the only source of income this family has? Put your mother back in the position of working 2 jobs to survive? He shook his head. I won't do it. And if you try to force me through the courts, you'll spend more in legal fees than you'll ever recover. My mother was crying now, quiet tears that spoke of a woman watching her world collapse for the second time in her life. Derek, please, there has to be a way to fix this. There is no fixing this, Pat, but his voice was gentler when speaking to her. Cyan has decided that her inheritance is more important than our marriage, more important than our family's stability. If she wants to destroy what we've built together over money, that's her choice. The manipulation was masterful. In Derek's version of events, I was the villain, a selfish daughter who would rather destroy her mother's marriage and financial security than accept that her stepfather had made difficult but necessary decisions for the family's benefit. I'm calling Mr. Morrison, I said, pulling out my phone. Go ahead, Derek replied, but before you do, think about what happens next. Criminal charges mean police investigations, court hearings, newspaper coverage. Is that really what you want for your mother, for this family? I looked at my mother, still crying silently among her orchids, and felt the weight of Derek's emotional blackmail. He was betting that my love for her would override my desire for justice. He was wrong.
The call to Harold Morrison that night set everything in motion. Within 24 hours, I found myself sitting in the Riverside Police Department, across from Detective Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in financial crimes. The sterile fluorescent lighting and institutional green walls felt surreal. I never imagined I'd be filing a criminal complaint against my own family. Miss Johnson, I've reviewed the documentation your attorney provided, Detective Chen said, spreading Derek's forged authorization forms across the metal table between us. This is one of the most systematic cases of identity theft and financial fraud I've seen in my 15 years on the force. She pointed to a series of signatures, all supposedly mine, spanning from 2019 to 2024. Your stepfather didn't just forge your signature, he created an entire false persona. Look at this progression. Early forgeries are crude attempts to copy your signature from high school documents, but by 2022, he'd developed a completely convincing version of your handwriting. The detective showed me withdrawal authorizations that looked like I could have signed them myself. Derek had practiced, perfected his technique over years, treating the theft of my inheritance like a craft to be mastered. There's more, Detective Chen continued, pulling out her laptop. We ran Derek Martinez through our database. This isn't his first offense. My heart stopped. What do you mean? In 2003, before he married your mother, Martinez was arrested in Cook County for check fraud and forgery. He served 18 months in minimum security. The charges involved forging his ex-wife's name on loan applications. I stared at the screen showing Derek's mugshot from 20 years ago. He looked younger, cockier, but unmistakably the same man who had been living in my house, eating dinner with my family, pretending to be a reformed construction worker who'd found love with my widowed mother. My mother doesn't know about this, I said numbly. I suspected as much. Predators like Martinez specifically target vulnerable individuals, widows, divorcees, people recovering from financial trauma. He probably presented himself as stable, reliable, someone who could handle the practical aspects of life while your mother grieved. The detective's words painted a picture that made my stomach churn. Derek hadn't fallen in love with my mother, he'd hunted her. A recently widowed woman with a teenage daughter and a substantial life insurance payout would have been the perfect mark. Detective, how long has he been planning this? Chen scrolled through more documents. Based on the pattern of his research into your family's finances, I'd estimate he began planning the trust fund theft within months of marrying your mother. Look at this timeline. She showed me a timeline she'd constructed. July 2016, Derek marries your mother. September 2016, first unauthorized inquiry into your trust fund status. December 2016, first attempted withdrawal which failed because he didn't have proper documentation. He spent the next 2 years learning the system, building relationships with bank staff who would eventually process his fraudulent requests without sufficient verification. So this was always his plan? Marry my mother to get access to my inheritance? I believe so, yes. And Miss Johnson, there is something else you need to know. Detective Chen's expression grew even more grave. We've discovered Derek has been accessing your personal information for purposes beyond the trust fund theft. She handed me another folder. Credit cards opened in your name while you were in college, small amounts charged, bills paid promptly to avoid raising suspicion, but the accounts were used to establish credit history he could manipulate. He's been building a comprehensive financial identity theft operation using your personal information. I flipped through credit card statements for accounts I'd never opened, showing purchases I'd never made, small amounts at hardware stores and restaurants in Illinois, designed to look like normal spending patterns. Derek had been living a double financial life using my identity. How much total damage are we talking about? Beyond the trust fund theft, approximately $47,000 in credit card debt and unauthorized loans. He's been careful to make minimum payments to avoid damaging your credit score, which suggests he was planning to use your identity for much larger fraud in the future. The scope of Derek's deception was breathtaking. This wasn't just about my inheritance. He'd been systematically preparing to destroy my financial future for years. Detective, what happens now? Chen closed the laptop and fixed me with a direct stare. Now we arrest Derek Martinez. Grand theft, identity theft, fraud, forgery. We're looking at multiple felony charges with potential prison time of 8 to 12 years. But I need you to understand something important.
What?
Your mother is going to be collateral damage in this investigation.
If she knowingly participated in any aspect of the fraud, she could face charges as well. If she was genuinely deceived, she's going to lose her husband, possibly her home if it was purchased with stolen funds, and her sense of security. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my mother, alone in that big house, tending to her orchids while her world crumbled around her. But I also thought about my father's letter, his explicit instructions to pursue legal action against anyone who would steal from my inheritance. Yes, I said firmly. I'm prepared for that. 2 days later, I watched from my bedroom window as police cars pulled into our driveway. Derek was in the garage, working on his truck's engine, completely unaware that Detective Chen and 3 uniformed officers were approaching with an arrest warrant. The confrontation was swift and professional. Derek's initial swagger, "This is harassment, I haven't done anything wrong," crumbled the moment Detective Chen read the charges and showed him the evidence. I saw his shoulders slump as reality hit. His carefully constructed scheme had been completely unraveled. My mother stood on the front porch in her bathrobe, watching in shock as the man she'd trusted with her heart and her future was handcuffed and placed in the back of a police car. When Derek looked up at her just before the car door closed, I saw something I hadn't expected. Genuine remorse, not for the crime, but for the pain his arrest was causing her. As the police cars disappeared down our street, neighbors emerging from their houses to watch the spectacle, my mother remained frozen on the porch. I went downstairs to find her still standing there, staring at the empty driveway as if Derek might somehow reappear. "Mom?" She turned to me with eyes that held no anger, only profound exhaustion. "How long have you known?" "Known what?" "That Derek was a criminal, that everything he told me about his past was a lie." I sat down beside her on the porch steps. "I found out about his previous conviction the same day you did, when Detective Chen told me. But Mom, did you suspect something was wrong?" Patricia was quiet for a long time, absently pulling weeds from the flower bed Derek had planted last spring with money he had stolen from me. "There were signs," she admitted finally. "Small things that didn't add up. Derek always insisted on handling all the financial paperwork himself, said it was too complicated for me to understand. He would get defensive when I asked simple questions about our accounts or his business expenses. And the lifestyle we were living, the renovations, the new car, the vacations, never quite matched what his construction income should have supported. Why didn't you investigate?" My mother's laugh was bitter. "Because I was afraid of what I'd find. After your father died, I was so lost, Cyan. I felt like I was drowning in responsibilities I didn't understand. The mortgage, insurance, your college planning, everything. When Derek came along and offered to take care of all those worries, it felt like salvation. I chose to trust him because the alternative, managing everything alone, terrified me." "So you suspected he might be lying about the money?" "I suspected he wasn't telling me the whole truth about something, but I convinced myself it was probably just pride, maybe embarrassment about not being as financially successful as he wanted me to believe. I never imagined," she gestured helplessly at the empty driveway, "I never imagined he was stealing from my daughter." We sat in silence as the reality of our new situation settled around us. Derek was in jail. My mother was facing the collapse of her second marriage and potential financial ruin, and I had recovered legal justice, but lost the only father figure I'd known since I was 15. "What happens now?" my mother asked. "Now we figure out how to rebuild. Derek's business assets will be seized and liquidated to pay restitution. The house might have to be sold if it was purchased with stolen funds. But Mom, there's something else." I handed her the folder Detective Chen had given me containing all of Derek's forged documents and fraudulent accounts. Dad left instructions with Mr. Morrison. If anyone ever stole from my trust fund, the law firm was supposed to pursue not just criminal charges, but civil recovery as well. That means Derek will be held financially responsible for every penny, plus interest and penalties. My mother flipped through the evidence, seeing for the first time the full scope of her husband's betrayal. Will you get your inheritance back? Most of it eventually. The legal process will take time, but Mr. Morrison is confident we can recover the majority of the stolen funds through asset seizure and restitution orders. For the first time since Derek's arrest, my mother smiled, a small, sad smile, but genuine. Your father would be proud of you. It took courage to do what you did. It took courage to realize that sometimes protecting family means stopping family members from hurting each other. Derek wasn't just stealing my future, he was poisoning our present with lies and manipulation. As we sat there on the porch steps, surrounded by the remnants of Derek's deception, I realized that this moment, my mother and me, finally honest with each other about the man who had divided us, was the first breakthrough toward healing our relationship and reclaiming our lives. 3 weeks after Derek's arrest, I thought we were finally moving toward resolution. Detective Chen had assured me the case was solid, Mr. Morrison was confident about asset recovery, and my mother seemed to be accepting the reality of our situation. Then, Derek's defense attorney, Marcus Webb, requested a meeting that would turn everything upside down again. Webb's office in downtown Chicago was a stark contrast to Mr. Morrison's traditional space, all glass and chrome, modern art on white walls, the kind of aggressive minimalism that screamed expensive legal representation. At 45, Webb had the polished appearance of someone who specialized in making problems disappear for people who could afford his services. Miss Johnson, he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his imposing desk, I appreciate you taking this meeting. I believe we can resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone involved. I had brought Mr. Morrison with me, and he looked distinctly uncomfortable in the ultra-modern surroundings. Mr. Webb, my client has made her position clear. She wants full restitution and justice for the crimes committed against her. Webb smiled, the kind of smile that made me immediately distrust him. Of course, and that's completely understandable. However, I think Miss Johnson should be aware of certain complications that have emerged since my client's arrest. He opened a thick folder and spread several documents across his desk. Derek Martinez has been fully cooperative with our investigation into his business assets. Unfortunately, the financial picture is more complex than anyone initially realized. What do you mean? I asked, though something in Webb's tone told me I wouldn't like the answer. Mr. Martinez's consulting business, which your stepfather built using capital from various sources, including your trust fund, has significant outstanding debts and legal obligations. Webb pointed to a financial statement that looked official, but meant nothing to me. Business loans totaling $180,000, outstanding payments to subcontractors worth $95,000, and equipment leases that cannot be transferred without penalty fees of approximately $40,000. Mr. Morrison leaned forward, studying the documents. Are you suggesting that liquidating the business assets won't cover the restitution amount? I'm saying that liquidating the business assets will result in a net loss, Webb replied smoothly. After paying outstanding business debts and legal obligations, the remaining value would be approximately $23,000, far short of the $329,000 your client is seeking to recover. The room felt like it was spinning. But Detective Chen said Derek's business was profitable. The business generates revenue, yes, but like many small construction consulting firms, it operates with significant leveraged debt. Your stepfather was essentially running the business on credit, using incoming contracts to pay previous obligations. Webb's expression was sympathetic but firm. It's not uncommon in the construction industry, but it does mean the business has negative net worth when liquidated. Mr. Morrison was making notes furiously. What about personal assets? The house, vehicles, other property purchased with the stolen funds? Webb's smile grew wider. That's where things become even more complicated. The house at 847 Maple Street in Riverside has been the Martinez family's primary residence for 8 years. Under Illinois homestead exemption laws, it cannot be seized to pay restitution if it represents the defendant's primary dwelling and the equity is below $15,000. The house has to be worth more than that, I protested. Derek spent thousands on renovations. Actually, no. He handed me an official property assessment. The house was purchased in 2016 for $285,000 with a $260,000 mortgage. Current market value is approximately $295,000, meaning total equity is roughly $35,000. However, your mother, Patricia Johnson Martinez, has legal claim to half that equity as Derek's spouse. Additionally, there's a $15,000 home equity loan that Derek used for business purposes, further reducing the available equity. The numbers weren't adding up the way I had expected. So, you're saying the house can't be used for restitution? Under Illinois law, seizing a primary residence for debt collection requires very specific circumstances that don't apply in this case. Your stepfather may be a criminal, but he's still entitled to certain legal protections regarding his basic shelter. Mr. Morrison interrupted. Mr. Webb, you're painting a very convenient picture for your client. What about the systematic identity theft, the credit cards opened in Miss Johnson's name, the ongoing fraud? All of which are separate criminal matters that will be addressed through the court system. But the financial reality remains. There simply aren't sufficient liquid assets available to provide meaningful restitution. My client faces significant prison time, loss of his business, and destruction of his marriage. The punishment is already severe. I felt like I was drowning in legal technicalities designed to protect Derek from the consequences of his actions. So what exactly are you proposing? Webb leaned back in his chair, finally getting to his real agenda. A plea bargain that acknowledges reality. Derek pleads guilty to reduced charges, grand theft rather than multiple felonies, in exchange for a shorter prison sentence and a realistic restitution schedule. Instead of demanding immediate payment of $329,000, which is impossible, we establish a payment plan based on his post-incarceration earning potential. What kind of payment plan?
Conservatively, Derek could realistically pay $500 per month after his release from prison. Over a 20-year period, that totals $120,000 in restitution, which is significantly more than the $23,000 you'd recover through asset liquidation. The audacity was breathtaking. Derek steals nearly $330,000 from me, and his lawyer was presenting a plan where I might eventually recover a third of that amount over 2 decades, assuming Derek actually made the payments after getting out of prison. This is unacceptable, Mr. Morrison said firmly. Miss Johnson's inheritance was systematically stolen through years of fraud. She shouldn't have to accept pennies on the dollar because the perpetrator was clever about hiding the money. Webb's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Morrison, I understand your client's frustration, but you need to consider the alternative. If this case goes to trial, Derek will present a very different narrative. A man who fell in love with a widow, tried to help stabilize her family's finances, made some poor decisions and cut some legal corners, but acted with ultimately good intentions. Good intentions? I couldn't keep the outrage out of my voice. A jury will hear that Derek used the money to save your family home from foreclosure, to pay for improvements that benefited everyone in the household, to start a legitimate business that employed local workers. Yes, he forged some documents and didn't follow proper procedures, but he'll argue that everything he did was intended to help the family, not hurt it. Webb pulled out another folder. More importantly, Derek's defense will include testimony about your mother's knowledge and consent. We have evidence that Patricia was fully aware of Derek's access to the trust fund and explicitly encouraged him to use that money for family purposes. My stomach dropped. That's not true. We have recorded phone calls, Miss Johnson.
Conversations Between Derek and Your Mother, where she specifically discusses using Cyan's college money for house repairs and business investments. She may not have understood the legal technicalities, but she was absolutely aware that Derek was spending your inheritance. "Let us hear these recordings," Mr. Morrison demanded. Webb pressed play on a small digital recorder. My mother's voice, clear and unmistakable, filled the room. "Derek, I know you're worried about the business loan, but what about Cyan's college fund? She's got scholarships covering most of her expenses, and that money is just sitting there. Couldn't we borrow from it temporarily?" And Derek's response, "Pat, I've been thinking the same thing. It's not like we're stealing from her, we're investing it for the family's benefit. When the business takes off, we'll pay it back with interest." My mother's voice again. "As long as it's legal and Cyan never has to know we used it, I don't want her worrying about money when she should be focusing on her studies." The recording continued for several more minutes, documenting conversations that painted my mother not as Derek's victim, but as his willing accomplice in spending my inheritance. "These recordings span a period of 3 years, Webb said after turning off the player. "Your mother wasn't deceived, Ms. Johnson. She was complicit. If this case goes to trial, she'll likely face conspiracy charges alongside Derek." I sat in stunned silence, processing the betrayal on top of betrayal. My mother hadn't just been willfully ignorant. She had actively encouraged Derek to steal from me as long as I never found out about it. "However," Webb continued, "our plea bargain offer includes immunity for your mother. Derek takes full responsibility for the fraud, Patricia faces no criminal charges, and your family can begin healing instead of being destroyed by a lengthy court battle." Mr. Morrison was studying the legal documents Webb had provided. "This is elaborate coercion, Mr. Webb. You're threatening to destroy Ms. Johnson's mother unless she accepts an inadequate settlement." "I'm presenting the reality of the situation," Webb replied. "Ms. Johnson can pursue maximum criminal penalties and civil recovery, which will likely result in both her stepfather and her mother facing serious prison time while recovering minimal restitution. Or she can accept a reasonable compromise that acknowledges the complexity of family financial decisions and focuses on moving forward rather than punishment." As I left Webb's office that afternoon, my head was spinning with new revelations that made everything more complicated. Derek wasn't just a criminal who had deceived my mother. He was a criminal whose actions my mother had actively supported. The inheritance left wasn't just about one man's greed. It was about 2 adults deciding that my future was less important than their present comfort. The setback was devastating, not because of the legal technicalities or financial complications, but because it revealed that my mother's betrayal was deeper and more intentional than I had ever imagined.
The recorded conversations haunted me for days after the meeting with Derek's attorney. I replayed my mother's words obsessively, trying to reconcile the woman who had raised me with the voice on those recordings, casually discussing stealing my inheritance. But it was my neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, who provided the perspective that changed everything. Mrs. Hoffman had lived next door for 37 years, watching our family through my father's death, my mother's remarriage, and now Derek's arrest. At 74, she had the kind of sharp intelligence that comes from decades of observing human nature without judgment. She found me sitting on our back porch 3 days after the attorney meeting, staring at nothing. "You look like someone who's lost more than money," she said, settling into the chair beside me with 2 cups of coffee. I told her everything: the inheritance theft, Derek's criminal history, the devastating recordings of my mother's complicity. Mrs. Hoffman listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, but never showing shock or surprise. "Cyan, I think you're missing something important about your mother's situation." "What could I possibly be missing? She actively encouraged Derek to steal from me." "She did," Mrs. Hoffman agreed. "But have you considered why?" I stared at her. "Because she's selfish? Because she cared more about her marriage than my future?" Mrs. Hoffman shook her head slowly. "Because she was terrified,"
Honey, your mother was a 37-year-old widow with no financial experience, drowning in responsibilities she never expected to handle alone. When Derek offered to take care of everything, she didn't just accept his help, she became completely dependent on it. That doesn't excuse theft. No, it doesn't, but it explains it. Mrs. Hoffman leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Your mother hasn't managed her own finances in over 20 years. Your father handled everything, then Derek took over. She doesn't know how to read investment statements, doesn't understand mortgage terms, has never negotiated a business contract. Derek didn't just steal your money, he stole your mother's confidence and independence. The perspective shift was jarring. I'd been thinking of my mother as Derek's accomplice, but Mrs. Hoffman was suggesting she was another type of victim, someone who had been systematically made helpless and then manipulated into participating in her own daughter's victimization. Mrs. Hoffman, even if that's true, she still chose to betray me. She chose to trust Derek over protecting you, yes. But Cyan, have you ever been in a position where your entire sense of security depended on one person, where questioning that person's judgment meant facing the possibility that everything you thought was stable might collapse? I hadn't. Even in college, even with student loans and uncertainty about my future, I'd never experienced the kind of financial terror that might drive someone to such desperate decisions. What are you suggesting I should do? Mrs. Hoffman smiled sadly. I'm suggesting that maybe winning isn't just about getting your money back or seeing Derek punished. Maybe winning is about breaking the cycle that made this possible in the first place. That evening, I called Detective Chen with a request that surprised her. I want to understand the full scope of Derek's operation, not just what he stole from me, but his entire pattern of targeting vulnerable women. Miss Johnson, we already have enough evidence to convict him. Additional investigation won't change your case. It's not about my case anymore. Detective, you mentioned that Derek specifically targets widows and divorcees. How many other women might he have victimized before my mother? Chen was quiet for a moment. That's actually a very good question. Financial predators like Derek rarely limit themselves to one victim. They often maintain multiple relationships, sometimes simultaneously. Could you investigate? Look for other women he might have defrauded? It would require significant resources, and the department would need justification for expanding the investigation beyond your case. What if I could provide that justification? 2 days later, I was back in Detective Chen's office with a proposal that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. I'd spent hours researching Derek's background, using social media, public records, and good old-fashioned internet detective work to trace his activities before he met my mother.
Detective, I found 3 other women Derek was involved with romantically in the 5 years before he married my mother, I said, spreading printouts across her desk. Linda Castellanos in Naperville, divorced in 2012 with a settlement from her ex-husband. Rebecca Santos in Schaumburg, widowed in 2013 with life insurance benefits. And Maria Rodriguez in Aurora, divorced in 2014 with significant asset division. Chen studied the information I'd gathered. You think he defrauded all of them? I think it's worth investigating. Look at the pattern. All recently divorced or widowed women with significant financial assets, all involved with Derek for 12 to 18 months before the relationships ended abruptly. What made you think to look for this? Something Mrs. Hoffman said about cycles. Derek didn't just randomly decide to target my mother. This is what he does. Find vulnerable women, gain their trust, exploit their finances, then move on to the next victim. My mother was just the first one he married. Detective Chen was already reaching for her phone. If you're right, we could be looking at a serial financial predator with potentially dozens of victims over the past 2 decades. That changes everything about how we approach this case. The expanded investigation took 3 weeks, but the results exceeded our worst expectations.
Derek Martinez had indeed been systematically targeting and defrauding vulnerable women for nearly 15 years. Linda Castellanos had lost $85,000 from her divorce settlement. Rebecca Santos had been convinced to invest her husband's life insurance money in Derek's construction business opportunities, losing $120,000. Maria Rodriguez had signed over the deed to a rental property Derek claimed he would manage for her, then discovered he'd sold it and kept the proceeds. None of them had reported the fraud because Derek had convinced each woman that she had willingly participated in business investments that simply hadn't worked out. He'd used the same combination of romantic manipulation, financial intimidation, and legal complexity to silence his victims. But more importantly, the investigation revealed something else. Derek had been planning to leave my mother. We found evidence on his laptop of communications with another woman in Rockford, Sandra Williams, recently divorced with a substantial asset division. Derek had been cultivating a relationship with her for the past 8 months, apparently planning to abandon your mother once he'd exhausted your inheritance and moved on to his next target. The revelation was simultaneously devastating and liberating. My mother hadn't just been Derek's accomplice, she was his victim too. Just like the women before her. He'd never intended to build a life with her. She was simply another mark in a long con that was designed to end when her usefulness expired. Does my mother know about Sandra Williams? Not yet. But, Miss Johnson, this information fundamentally changes your legal position. Your mother wasn't Derek's partner in a family financial decision. She was his victim in a calculated fraud scheme that was always intended to leave her abandoned and financially destroyed. I thought about the plea bargain Derek's attorney had offered, the recordings of my mother discussing my inheritance, the way I'd been viewing her as a traitor rather than another casualty of Derek's predatory behavior. Detective, I want to change my approach to this case. What do you mean? I want to organize the other victims. I want to build a case that exposes Derek's entire operation, not just what he did to me. And I want to help my mother understand that she wasn't his partner, she was his target, just like Linda, Rebecca, Maria, and Sandra. Chen looked surprised. That's a significant shift from seeking individual restitution to organizing a victim advocacy effort. Yes, it is, because I've realized something important. Getting my money back won't fix what Derek destroyed. He didn't just steal my inheritance, he destroyed my mother's ability to trust her own judgment, isolated her from her support systems, and set her up to be abandoned once he'd taken everything valuable. So, what do you want to do? I want to break the cycle. I want to make sure Derek can never do this to another family, and I want to help my mother rebuild her life based on truth instead of manipulation. The evolution wasn't just about changing legal strategy. It was about recognizing that real justice required healing the deeper wounds Derek had inflicted on everyone he touched. My inheritance mattered, but it mattered less than ensuring no other daughter would discover that her mother had been systematically victimized by a predator who specialized in exploiting grief and fear. For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt like I had a plan that might actually lead to something better than just recovering money.
The courtroom on Derek's sentencing day was packed with more people than anyone had expected. In the front rows sat 4 women who had never met before, but shared an identical story of betrayal. Linda Castellanos, Rebecca Santos, Maria Rodriguez, and my mother, Patricia. Behind them, supporters filled nearly every seat. Family members, friends, and advocates from the Financial Crimes Victim Support Network we'd established during the 6 months since Derek's arrest. Judge Margaret Thornton, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for harsh sentences in fraud cases, reviewed the victim impact statements as Derek sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his previously confident demeanor replaced by the hollow expression of someone who finally understood the magnitude of his crimes. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Thornton began, "in my 28 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered such systematic, predatory behavior. Your crimes span 15 years and have devastated the lives of at least 7 women and their families. The investigation had ultimately uncovered 2 additional victims beyond the 4 we'd initially identified, bringing Derek's total theft to over $750,000 across multiple families. But the numbers only told part of the story. I stood to deliver my victim impact statement, looking directly at Derek as I spoke. Your Honor, Derek Martinez didn't just steal money from me. He stole my trust in family, my sense of security, and my relationship with my mother. But more than that, he stole something from society, the belief that vulnerable people can seek help and companionship without being preyed upon. I turned to address the courtroom, where several reporters were documenting what had become a landmark case in financial elder abuse prosecution. Derek's crimes weren't opportunistic. They were calculated, methodical, and designed to exploit the most vulnerable moments in women's lives, when they were grieving, isolated, and desperate for someone to help them navigate challenges they'd never faced alone. From the defendant's table, Derek's shoulders sagged further. His attorney, Marcus Webb, had tried everything: mental health defenses, claims of gambling addiction, arguments about Derek's own traumatic childhood, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the pattern of behavior too clear to explain away. Judge Thornton nodded toward me. Continue, Ms. Johnson. Your Honor, through the victim advocacy network we've established, I've learned that Derek's greatest crime wasn't the theft itself. It was the systematic destruction of his victims' confidence in their own judgment. Each woman he targeted has struggled not just with financial loss, but with the devastating realization that someone they trusted completely was manipulating them from the very beginning. I gestured toward the other women in the front row. Linda Castellanos stopped dating entirely for 3 years because she couldn't trust her ability to recognize deception. Rebecca Santos moved in with her adult children because she no longer felt capable of managing her own life. Maria Rodriguez filed for bankruptcy, not just because of Derek's theft, but because the psychological trauma left her unable to make any financial decisions. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the soft sound of Linda crying. But, Your Honor, I want to tell you about the recovery that's been possible when victims receive proper support instead of shame and isolation. I pulled out notes I'd prepared about the Victim Support Network's work over the past months. Linda has not only recovered emotionally, but has become a certified financial counselor who now helps other fraud victims navigate the recovery process. Rebecca Santos has resumed independent living and volunteers with a senior advocacy organization. Maria Rodriguez has rebuilt her credit and started a small business helping other Latina women understand financial literacy. Judge Thornton was making notes as I spoke. And my mother, Patricia, has discovered strength she never knew she had. She's completed courses in financial management, learned to read investment statements, and now volunteers with the domestic violence shelter in our county because she understands how financial manipulation is used to control victims. I paused, looking at my mother, who had tears in her eyes, but was sitting straighter than I had seen her sit in years. Your Honor, Derek Martinez caused tremendous damage, but the response to his crimes has created something powerful: a network of women who refuse to let financial predators isolate and victimize vulnerable people. We helped recover over $200,000 in assets for his victims through civil lawsuits and asset seizure. We've worked with banks to improve verification procedures for elderly and recently widowed customers. We've lobbied for stronger penalties for financial elder abuse.
Judge Thornton looked directly at Derek. Mr. Martinez, do you have anything to say before I pass sentence? Derek stood slowly, his voice barely audible. Your Honor, I know that nothing I say can fix what I've done. I told myself for years that I was helping these women, that I was investing their money to create better lives for everyone. But I was lying to myself as much as I was lying to them. He turned toward the front row where his victims sat. Linda, Rebecca, Maria, Patricia. I destroyed your trust, your security, your peace of mind. I stole your money, but worse than that, I stole your confidence in your own judgment. I made you doubt yourselves when you should have been doubting me." His voice cracked slightly. "I can't undo any of it. I can't give you back the years you've spent recovering from what I did. All I can do is accept responsibility and hope that my punishment prevents other men like me from doing this to other families." Judge Thornton reviewed her notes one final time. "Mr. Martinez, the court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, totaling $751,847 plus accrued interest. All assets will be liquidated, and you will be required to turn over any future earnings above basic living expenses until restitution is complete." The gavel came down with finality, and Derek was led away without looking back at any of us. As we left the courthouse, the group of women who had started as Derek's victims walked together toward the parking garage. The sunshine felt different somehow, brighter, warmer, full of possibilities that had seemed impossible 6 months earlier. "Cyan," my mother said, linking her arm through mine, "I know I can never fully make up for what I allowed to happen to your inheritance, but I want you to know that losing Derek was the best thing that ever happened to me." "What do you mean?" "I mean that for 8 years, I lived in fear. Fear of making financial mistakes. Fear of being alone. Fear of being responsible for my own life. Derek offered to take away all those fears, and I let him, even when it meant betraying you." She stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "But this experience has taught me that being afraid of independence is far more dangerous than actually being independent." Linda Castellanos, who had become not just another victim, but a genuine friend over the past months, joined our conversation. "Patricia's right. Derek's greatest crime was convincing us we were helpless when we were actually incredibly strong." Rebecca Santos nodded in agreement. "I spent 3 years thinking I was too stupid to manage my own money because Derek had convinced me I didn't understand complicated financial matters. Now I realize he was the one who didn't understand. He didn't understand that stealing from people eventually catches up with you." As we reached our cars, I reflected on how completely my understanding of justice had evolved. 6 months ago, I'd wanted Derek punished and my money returned. Those things had happened, but they felt less important now than the relationships we'd built and the systems we'd changed. The inheritance my father left me had been about more than money. It was about security, independence, and the freedom to build my own future. Derek had stolen the money, but through the process of fighting for justice, I discovered something more valuable: the ability to transform personal trauma into collective strength. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sandra Williams, the woman Derek had been planning to target next. She'd joined our victim advocacy network, even though Derek hadn't succeeded in defrauding her, and she'd become one of our most effective volunteers in identifying potential financial predators. "Cyan just helped a 61-year-old widow in Rockford recognize warning signs in a man who is pressuring her to invest her husband's life insurance money. She's safe, and he's being investigated. Derek is in prison, but we're still protecting people from men like him." That text message felt like the real resolution, not Derek's sentence or the recovered money, but the knowledge that his pattern of predation had been permanently broken. The cycle that had begun with his first victim 15 years ago had ended with education, advocacy, and women refusing to be isolated in their victimization. As I drove home to the house my mother and I now shared as equal partners rather than as guardian and dependent, I realized that my father's inheritance had served its intended purpose after all. It had secured my future, not through money sitting in an account, but through the strength I discovered in fighting for justice and the relationships I'd built in refusing to let Derek's crimes define our family's story. The money was being recovered through restitution payments, the relationships were restored through honesty and shared purpose, and the future was secure because we'd learned that the best protection against predators is a community of people who refuse to let anyone face their vulnerabilities alone. My father would have been proud.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.